Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel for another top 10. I love filming top 10s so much. It's so arbitrary, but here we are. It's kind of a part of our culture at this point, isn't it? To kind of condense the things we like into top 10s. So today, as you can tell by the title, we're going to be talking about my top 10 comic book series, which includes manga. However, I have not included graphic novels, which again is very arbitrary and sometimes hard to define, but generally I think the big difference between a comic and a graphic novel is that a comic is serialized and comes out over a long period of time, often quite a few issues individually that you can read. But at least perhaps in volumes over a long period of time with like multiple story arcs, and that's not necessarily true of graphic novels. However, there are graphic novels that started off as webcomics and have multiple books in them, so maybe I could have included them in here, but maybe that's a separate video because I also have a lot of favourite graphic novels. One thing I will say though is neither is better than the other. Reading graphic novels and not comic books doesn't make you intellectually superior. All are amazing, incredible art forms, pieces of literature, and often beautifully illustrated. So I hope you find some new recommendations in this video, and I'd love to get some recommendations from you as we go on based on what you can tell I like. So yeah, with that utter ramble over, let's take a look at the books, and I'm going to start with those that are completed. So those comic book series which have been published in full from beginning to end. We've got that satisfying conclusion. There is no intention for more to come out in the future, and then I have a section for those that are ongoing and those that we are potentially unaware of whether they're going to keep going or not, as much as that devastates me. So yeah, starting with those that are finished. The first one will probably come as no surprise to you because I think it's probably one of the comic book series I've talked about the most on my channel over the years since I started reading it. And I don't want to say it's my absolute favourite because all of these comic books deliver something different for me, but it's up there, and that is Giant Days. So this series is written by John Allison, who I've actually read some other comic books by and also really enjoyed, but Giant Days is like the standout one for me, and illustrated by Max Sarin and Lisa Tremaine. It is also, I think, the only sort of contemporary, entirely non-fantastical, non-science fiction, non-paranormal, non-mythological, what have you, series on this list, because I tend to gravitate towards those comic books that have a little bit of the like magical in them, whatever that may be. There is another one on this list that I think probably doesn't really come under the magical category, but this is like the most rooted in reality, shall we say. This is like the most mundane of the stories, but it's anything but mundane in reality. It follows a group of 3 university friends, so they've just started their first week of university in the beginning of the series. It's Freshers Week, and they all meet each other and they get to know each other and they become best friends. We do hear from a few of their other friends throughout the series, but like they're the primary protagonists. And then throughout the series it follows them as they do their undergraduate degrees. So they're 3-year undergraduates, the 3 years they spend together at university in the UK, from beginning to end, and it's such a lovely journey. It's definitely one of those comic books where if you have been to university in the UK, you will find a lot of the moments quite relatable. There's these very relatable moments that get turned into something very humorous that you laugh out loud at, like the issue of trying to find somewhere to live after you're no longer in halls of residence, that kind of thing, when you're searching for a flat and all of the drama of that. And it really took me back to being in my undergraduate degree, as well as how university can be a place where you meet some of the most important people in your life from there on out, and you bond over mutual interests, but also how your lives might not all be on the same trajectory. I have absolute best friends, people I love the most in the world from my undergraduate, and we all did the same degree, but we've all done very different things with our lives. And yeah, what I'm getting at is that I found this series very relatable, very nostalgic, but it's also just so funny. Like, I don't think you need to have gone to university in the UK to enjoy this series. It's so comical, and really a lot of the experiences of the protagonists are just like the experiences of young people, and in that sense they're also very relatable. And I love the cast of characters. They're all very unique, but they manage to like gel with one another. Their unique personalities create a beautiful friendship, and there's drama and silliness and fun fun and compassion and lightheartedness and some slightly more serious issues. It's not like a super serious series, but we do get, like, for example, one of the main characters exploring and figuring out her sexuality. So, you know, there are those more serious sides of life in there too, and it's just perfect. Like, I just cannot recommend this series more highly, particularly to those who don't necessarily gravitate towards contemporary series like me. Give it a chance. It's really, really good. Next up is, I think, potentially the first comic book series I read from start to finish, from like end to end, all the way through the whole story arc, and quite quickly at that, but there are only 6 volumes, I believe, so it's also kind of explainable in that way. You know, some series have like 20 plus volumes, so they're going to take longer, and that is Lock and Key. So Lock and Key is written by Joe Hill and illustrated by Gabriel Rodriguez, and you might recognise the title even if you're not into comic books, because it did have a Netflix mini-series adaptation. I've not seen the show, so I can't comment on the similarities or dissimilarities, but if you think that I'd like this show, if I like the comic book, let me know, because it's kind of in the back of my mind that I've always meant to watch it. It's always kind of like both terrifying and exciting to watch adaptations of your favourite books or comic books. So yeah, I haven't seen the show, but I love the comic books. This is a fantastical horror series, and I think, again, it's probably one of the first horror comic book series that got me into horror comic books, which I really enjoy in general, and I'm always looking for new ones in. And I also think it's one of the most unique that I've read. Like, some of the horror comic books I've dipped my toe in have felt very predictable and samey, and, you know, don't manage to keep you on edge through every volume. Like, every volume doesn't manage to like be engaging, but as it goes on, the sort of themes and the storyline can feel quite repetitive, but that is not the case with Lock and Key. It is a perfectly balanced 6-volume series. Like, it is so well structured, it feels so well thought through. It doesn't feel like one of those series where they had no idea where it was going. It felt like someone had figured it out from beginning to end before they even started. Now, I don't know if that's true, but that's what it feels like. And the premise of the story itself is that you're following 3 children, 3 members of a family, 3 siblings who have moved house with their mother after their father was murdered. So they've been through something incredibly traumatic, and they go through this big upheaval of their life and move to this home, this big manor home, which holds a lot of secrets and has its own dark history, which you get flashbacks to. And whilst in this home, they start to find keys, and these keys are connected to a sort of like supernatural other power. I won't say anything else about that, I don't want to spoil it for you, but there is danger and magic and possibility in this house and in these keys, and it's, yeah, a mysterious one. Well, like, what else should I say? I don't want to give anything away, but it's very dark and it can be very gory, so bear that in mind. But it definitely keeps you on the edge of your seat, and it's really interesting to follow the storyline and the mystery and learn more about the past and get these flashbacks and see how it all comes together. So yeah, really love this series. We then have Lumberjanes, quite a departure from Lock and Key, because I personally would say that this is suitable for children and adults as comic books go. It's by Shannon Waters, Grace Ellis, Gus Allen and N.D. Stevenson, and it's about a group of friends who go to a summer camp, a little bit like sort of Girl Scouts vibe, but it's called Lumberjanes, and they are the Lumberjanes, and it starts off again kind of mundane, ordinary world, contemporary timeline, a group of friends sort of in that period of life, well, I guess like pre-teen phase where you're going through a transition. And they go to the summer camp, but then they end up finding some slightly strange paranormal stuff while they're there, and some really wacky things happen to them and their camp counsellor, and it is so charming. It's utterly hilarious. The humour is perfect. There also is some phenomenal representation. There's some great representation of first love and queer love, and I really appreciate that. I really love queer representation in my comics. I mean, I love it in all my books, but I have to say a lot of the comics on this list do have queer rep, so that's really nice. And I love seeing queer rep for younger readers and younger characters, because it kind of, you know, I think harkens to a lot of member of the queer community's experiences of figuring out their sexuality at quite a young age, so that's really nice. I also love the art style. This is one of the absolute standout art styles for me in this list. I would like frame half of the pages from these comic books. They're so Cute but beautiful. Cute and beautiful, that's what they are. There's also some references to Greek mythology if that's something you're looking for in your literature, because I know, like me, a lot of you love Greek mythology, so there's some fun references in there. But at its heart, it's just very much a story of friendship, a story of community, a story of like supporting and lifting one another up and figuring out who you are, and I think it's lovely. Then I have one more comic book series that's complete before I get on to the 2 complete manga series, and that is Fables. Now, Fables is not the first comic book series I read, or the first comic book I read. I think possibly the first ever like traditional comic books for like older readers I read were when I was a teenager, and I read The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen and a bunch of Tomb Raider comic books from my library, so they're probably the earliest ones I read, but those are very vague in my memory. But Fables is one of my first favourites. Like, I started reading Fables when I started BookTube. I think that's when I discovered Fables, and I started BookTube over 10 years ago, over a decade ago now, in 2012, the end of 2012. So I first read the series a long time ago, and it's one that I really enjoyed reading the first time around, and have since started a reread of it, and I'm realising that I enjoy it just as much in a reread, if not more. Now that I'm a little bit older, I feel like I'm appreciating it even more and really enjoying it. It feels like it's got more of a traditional art style that I associate with like more old school comics, that kind of like noir vibe, that superhero vibe, but it's not a superhero comic book. It's about fairy tale characters who have had to escape from the fairy tale realm and set up their community in our world. So they were forced out of the fairy tale realm by a war and a dark presence in the fairy tale realm, and they have sort of built this like little mini city within a bigger real city for themselves. You know, they've got a mayor, they've got a deputy mayor, they've got a police officer, they've got various different rules and regulations, and you get characters including Snow White, the Big Bad Wolf, Red Rose, Jack and the Beanstalk, like Cinderella, Beauty and the Beast. They're all there, they're all mixed in there, and I love that. And you get more characters as the stories go on, obviously, but they're sort of existing in their world and figuring things out, and whether they want to try and return to the Fable world, etc, etc. There's like a massive story arc to this series. It's a big series. But the premise of book 1 is that Rose Red, Snow White's sister, has gone missing, and the scene in her apartment looks pretty dire. So Snow White, who is the deputy mayor, gets in the sort of like police officer detective of their community, the Big Bad Wolf, to investigate, and that's kind of where things jump off. But that's just kind of like the introduction, I would say, to a much larger, far-reaching story arc, and it's really interesting. And if you're into fairy tales, you're gonna love this because it's such an interesting take on them. Oh, and of course I should mention this one's written by Bill Willingham and illustrated by a variety of different artists over the years. Okay, so the first manga I want to talk about that's complete is like one of my favourite things like in the whole world, just like things, not even series, just things. And I also adore the anime, so if you'd rather watch it than read it, both are fantastic. And that is Inu Yasha by Rumiko Takahashi, and yeah. You know what, it's just so hard to find words to describe why you love something because it's just like a feeling. But I love Inu Yasha. So this is the story of Kagome, who is a young girl living in like modern day Japan, who ends up stumbling on a portal to feudal Japan, so a magical portal to a fantastical version of feudal Japan filled with demons. And this, of course, is where she meets Inu Yasha, who is half demon, half human, which is quite rare in this world and definitely makes him a bit of an outcast. And Kagome ends up making friends, sometimes filled with strife, with Inu Yasha and a few other main characters, and they go on adventures together, specifically to try and find all the different pieces of this jewel that has been like destroyed, split into I don't even know how many pieces, but a lot of pieces, and spread across this feudal Japanese world, and they have to go and find them all for some quest right? Okay, I'm not going to give away too much because this is again quite a long series. It goes over quite a few volumes. So they're off on this quest, and basically, you know, like every volume is them going to try and find more pieces of this jewel. They encounter friends and foes, terrifying monsters, and there's like evil big baddies. There are friends they make along the way. I do love a like sort of found family group of friends going in an adventure storyline. Like, it's definitely up my street. And in between all of that, Kagome still goes back to modern day Tokyo to go to school and see her family and do other things, and then go back to feudal Japan. So she's jumping back and forth between the two. She's not like stuck in feudal Japan for the whole time, which adds a sort of like, I think, interesting undercurrent of like your high school drama manga to it, although most of it I would say is set in the magical feudal Japanese world. So yeah, I love this series. I love the characters. I love their sometimes antagonistic friendships. I love seeing how they grow throughout the series, particularly Inu Yasha, who's a character that I just have so much feeling for and just like want the best for, and I just have always loved this series. I've watched the anime multiple times. I've read the entire comic book and I love them, and I would like more of you to read it if you haven't already. So that's Inu Yasha, but the next manga on my series is Fruits Basket by Natsuki Takaya, and like with Inu Yasha, this is the artist and the author. This is a story which is rooted in our modern world. It's set in our modern world, and again follows a high school student, in this case Toru Honda, but it also has magic in there. It's very much like, I would say like primarily like a kind of contemporary slice of life story with potential love stories and love triangles in there, as well as like explorations of grief, but it has like this magical backing to it, and that is that there is this family who Toru Honda ends up living with when she is discovered by her classmate Yuki living in a tent in the woods. So her mother has passed away, and she was like a single parent household, and now she's homeless, so she's like living in this tent and going to school every day and pretending everything's fine until Yuki finds her and invites her to live with him and his family, including his uncle and his cousin. And she discovers whilst living with them that they have a curse on them, which means whenever they are hugged by somebody of the opposite sex, they are transformed into an animal from the zodiac. So that obviously puts a bit of a damper on their lives, especially if they're interested in dating people or falling in love with people of the opposite gender. So she learns more about them and their complicated family and like their own grief of this curse that they have to put up with, as well. She's also sort of recovering from the grief of losing her mother, and she manages to find this new family and these new people. So we have this, again, sort of found family dynamic. We have a potential love story and very much a love triangle in the story. Like, if you hate love triangles, be warned, because it's a big part of this. But it's kind of one that you do get really, you get drawn into, and it's one of those believable love triangles where it's not just like, oh, obviously she's going to pick one or the other of them. It's like, oh no, they're both wonderful. I feel like I sound like a teenager the way I'm talking about it, but I started reading this series as a teenager, so maybe I have a lot of teenage emotions tied up in it. It's another one that I've seen the anime adaptation of and love, so again, if you'd rather watch the anime than read the manga, that's also brilliant. And it's quite an emotional one. It can be quite like heart-wrenching in moments. I would say it has a lot of like sadness and like grief-orientated plot lines in it, but it's also very beautiful and bolstered by the beauty of found family and friendship and love. So yeah, love it. That then brings me on to the 4 series that are not currently completed, that are currently ongoing. However, for some of these, myself, and I don't think anybody apart from those involved in them, know the future of them and whether they will get future issues, whether they'll just be a long way down the line. A lot of them are like independent projects that take a lot of time and have to be done in between other things. So I don't know when the next issues will come out. I don't know if more issues will come out. Obviously I'm really hoping they will, because I love all of these series, but I still want to talk about them because they're still my favourites, and a few of them in particular I really think are still really enjoyable, and it doesn't matter if they don't get finished. Like the first one I'm going to talk about, if it never gets finished, I don't think it matters. I'd love it to, but I think the 3-volume arc that currently exists is fantastic, so that's also good. But I will mention the date of the last published volume, just so you're aware of where they're at when I talk about them. So that first one I mentioned is Moonstruck. So this one is actually by the creator of Lumberjanes, Grace Ellis, as well as Shea Beagle, and with the first volume being illustrated by Kate Leth. So there are different illustrators throughout the series, but it is one of my like absolute favourites. Like I would maybe call it my favourite if it had an entire like story arc at this point. I think it's hard to call something like your #1 favourite if it's not finished. So there is that, and I can't find any information online about when potentially more might come out or if more is going to come out. But the last volume came out in 2020. I still think it's worth reading though, because I don't think it matters just from like an enjoyment perspective whether it's finished or not. I still think it's fantastic, but you know, the more people that read and support the next comic books on the list, the more likely they are to get more issues, so there's that to bear in mind as well. So Moonstruck is another one that's actually set at college, following a few different characters, a group of friends and couples going to college in what feels more like a version of the US, but it's not the real world. It's like a fantastical version of our world, doing all of like your regular college stuff, like going to coffee shops and writing their essays, and working in coffee shops, and going to like frat house parties, and going on dates, and trying to figure out their careers and write books, and sort of flirt with people, and just like the little things, but none of them are humans. So the character we start with is a werewolf. We then have centaurs, fairies, gorgons, a variety of other magical creatures all living in this world, doing just like ordinary stuff, and that's what's kind of fun about it. There is obviously like a mix of magic in there because that is part of their everyday lives, but it's really just like quite an ordinary everyday story about friends at college, and like budding romances and like budding queer romances, which I love, but with magical creatures, which like just makes everything better, right? Like if everybody could be a magical creature instead of human, that would be better, right? Like humans are boring. But really that's all I can say about it at the moment. It's currently got 3 volumes, last one which came out in 2020. The future of we'll have to see. Next up is Spell on Wheels, which currently has 2 volumes as of 2020 as well, and the first volume of which is also illustrated by Kate Leth. It's interesting because you start to notice, I think, the more comic books you read, artists and authors that you really love, and even though I've not always intentionally picked these stories up because they're written or illustrated by the same people, I'll then discover that they are, and I'll be like, well, it makes sense because I love their other work, so of course I love this work. In this case, the story is written by Megan Levins, and it's about a group of 3 friends who are all witches. Again, we have some queer rep in there, which is fantastic, and they have their own little coven together. They read tarot, they make spells, they all have like their own speciality, shall we say, but things are kind of turned on their head when their house is broken into and they are robbed, and a bunch of their like magical ingredients and their magical paraphernalia are stolen, only for them to discover that it's being sold on like a magical version of eBay. So they decide to go on a road trip together to find out where their stuff is, get it back, and who stole it and what's going on. And it's brilliant. I love the road trip nature of it. I love each of the protagonists. I like when you get like a little sort of ensemble cast and each one feels unique but also really complementary to the others, so that's really fun, and I think this is just a really fun premise. On the topic of witches though, I do have another witchy comic book on this list, and that is Black Magic. So this one is definitely on the darker side of witchy. I would also call it a bit of like a grim noir thriller mystery series, and that is very much reflected in the art style, which again has this very like grim noir, low colour, very black and white with splashes of colour here and there illustration style that really suits the storyline and like really immerses you in it, and I think adds to the darkness of the storyline, because in this one we follow a police detective in the US who's also a witch, although she keeps that side of herself sort of hidden because people wouldn't necessarily understand, but she is Wiccan, but she's a Wiccan witch. She is a religious witch in the modern day, but she also has identifiable magical powers, as do the other witches she knows. In fact, the best like sort of parallel for kind of the lore and the witchcraft side of this is maybe Charmed, something like Charmed, which is one of my favourite TV shows of all time. And the story starts off with our protagonist Rowan turning up to a case only to find out that there is perhaps a magical facet to this case that she can't share with her colleagues, but mean that it might be connected to the other half of her life, the other part of her life, and even more personally to herself. So she's very much balancing these two worlds. Whether she's doing it well or not is up to you to decide, but I like how dark this series is. Like, I wouldn't call it horror, but it's definitely darker than a lot of the series on this list, which are quite cutesy and upbeat. And I love the way the art reflects the story and sort of gives that darkness depth. Like, there is something really special about comic books and graphic novels that some stories really benefit from. Like, all of these stories wouldn't necessarily be better if they were just books. The art is as big a part of it as anything else, and it can add so much thematically, tonally, to the storytelling, to the feelings you get as a reader. So I just want to like appreciate that for a second. And on that topic, I should mention the artist and writer of this series, who are Greg Rucka and Nicholas Scott. So yeah, again, fingers crossed for more in the future. I've got a good feeling about this one. It's on 3 volumes and the last one came out in 2021. And worth noting for all of these series is there's always usually been quite long gaps between every volume. It's not that unusual for there to be like 1, 2, 3 years. So that's worth noting. And then lastly for ongoing series, is Snot Girl. Yes, Snot Girl. What a title. I think this has got one of the best titles. I just think it's so absurd and immediately introduces so many strange questions, and also gives you a sense of how surreal and weird this comic book is. I think this is like one of the weirdest ones. Not because it's more magical or anything like that, but because it's just quite like bizarre to read. You're like, what is going on half the time, but like in a really good way. Like, it gives you questions and you want to know more. And in this series we're actually following Lottie, who is a beauty and fashion influencer. Like, her whole life is online, but obviously in a very heavily filtered way. In real life, she is a bit more of a mess than she presents herself to be. I mean, none of this is surprising, is it? And in particular, she has like wicked allergies, which is what the reference to the title is, and I mean like bad allergies, but she's like really ashamed of them, and she like doesn't want to appear anything but perfect online. And although that could just seem like a very like ordinary premise about like a girl figuring herself out, trust me, there's more going on. There's possible crime, there's possible stalkers, there's a strange new friend that she makes that's behaving really bizarrely, and it's basically just a series of weird going-ons, weird mysteries. We don't know what anybody's motivations are, what anybody's up to, what's going on in this world that Lottie is a part of. Is there something more sinister? And part of me thinks we might have to wait for more volumes to find out the answers to all those questions, unfortunately. So yeah, I also love the art style. It's very like wacky, surreal. The colours are so bold and brilliant. They really bring all of this to life. And the creators, before I forget to mention, are Brian Lee O'Malley and Leslie Hung. But that is actually my top 10. Those are my top 10 comic books and manga series that I love so much, that I would highly recommend you check out and read. But before I go, I do have 2 quick honourable mentions. And one of the things you've probably been able to tell so far in this video is that I am not a superhero girly. None of these comic books have been superhero comic books, even though I think a lot of us, it's like sort of associate comic books with superheroes, or at least like our first introduction to comic books is through the concept of superheroes. I've never been a superhero girly. Just haven't. But there are 2 like one-shot, so standalone comic books, maybe perhaps more like graphic novels, that are from superhero franchises that I really love and want to just quickly mention. So the first one is Midnighter and Apollo, which is a DC storyline about 2 superheroes, Midnighter and Apollo, funnily enough, and they are not superheroes I know much about. Like, I think in this day and age it's hard not to have any knowledge of superheroes and such, and supervillains, because of like cinema and how much media is out there. And it's not like I've never read a superhero comic, I'm just not that into them. But I didn't know anything about Midnighter and Apollo going into this story. I knew about some DC superheroes, but I didn't know anything about these characters, and I don't think it mattered. I still thought this storyline very much stood on its own because it's a retelling of the Greek myth of Orpheus and Eurydice, and it's a queer retelling about two gay men, two gay superheroes in love with one another who are separated when Apollo is taken to the underworld and Midnighter has to adventure down there to save him, as in the myth of Orpheus and Eurydice. Obviously I won't say anything about how it all works out, but I found this such a heartfelt story, which I thought was very much a queer story. Like, this book is about queer love, about queer trauma, about the experiences of coming out and being rejected and finding love and support and community, and it's gorgeous. And I don't think you really need to know much about the DC superhero world to enjoy it, so I just wanted to quickly mention that one because it's one I also discussed in my own non-fiction book, All the Violet Tiaras, Queering the Greek Myths, as it is a queer Greek myth retelling, and I read it when I was researching for that book and just sort of fell head over heels with it, and I've been recommending it to quite a few people, so there you go. I then have one which is actually about a super villain, shall we say, and that is Harleen, and this is the origin story of Harley Quinn, which again is another like DC character, so apparently I'm a DC girl, even though I would always have said X-Men were my favourite superheroes, and they're Marvel. I really enjoyed this. I know a little bit about Harley Quinn, you know, like I've seen the Suicide Squad films, I've seen Batman films, I've watched like the Harley Quinn cartoon, and I think she's a really interesting character, so I decided to pick this book up with the intention of maybe learning more about her, maybe getting into her storyline a little bit more, because it is this sort of like origin that again you don't really need to know much about going into, and it's sort of tracing her story from becoming this psychologist. Harley Quinn is famously a doctor who is led down this supervillain path by the Joker when she takes him as a patient while he's in prison in Arkham, and it follows that journey, and I really enjoyed it because it's also kind of a story of abuse, about domestic abuse, about manipulative and toxic relationships, but in this like superhero world. So I thought this was really fantastic, and again, I mean, I have some context, right? Like, I have seen stuff, I do know a little bit about these characters, but I'm not super into the world, and I haven't read the comic books, and I still enjoyed it. So yeah, wanted to briefly mention both of those, but that brings me to the end of this video. Would love more recommendations because I'm desperately in need of some new favourites. So let me know yours in the comments down below, and I'd also love to know like the comic book or graphic novel or manga that got you into the genre. That would be really interesting. But until next time, happy reading, and I'll see you all again soon. Bye everyone.